I am the archaeologist. So what that means is that I work on our public lands in the area to preserve, protect, record, interpret cultural resources across the region. And so I just wanted to thank you all for joining tonight, where I will be kind of diving in a little deeper into the history of Dripping Springs Natural Area, specifically Dripping Springs itself, which I'm sure probably a lot of people on this presentation have visited themselves. It's probably one of the most popular recreation areas that is close to Las Cruces. So really what I wanted to talk about tonight is kind of talk about the history, really the story of Van Patten and Dr. Nathan Boyd, and kind of the story of these two men. But also, as some of you might know, when you hike up to Dripping Springs, there's only so much that our interpretive panels tell us about this history that is here in our local area. So really, my presentation is going to be about 40 minutes worth, and we'll have during this, I think you all have access to the question and answer chat. So if you think of questions during the presentation, just pop them in the chat, and we'll kind of get to answering those after the presentation. So we'll kind of start now where I do this as part of our 10th anniversary for the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks National Monument. It was designated in 2014 by President Obama through presidential proclamation through the authority of the Antiquities Act of 1906. So I wanted to kind of set the setting. Maybe not everyone has hiked to Dripping Springs Natural Area, but it is kind of one of the most well-known developed recreation areas in and around Las Cruces, New Mexico. And this is really kind of the crown jewel or heart of recreation for the National Monument, which is the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks. And as some of you may know, that is about 500,000 acres of protected public land here in Doña Ana County and Luna County. And this natural area has several hiking trails. Dripping Springs is probably the most well-known and popular because of these well-preserved historic ruins that are along the trail. So, I end up doing quite a few interpretive programs myself throughout the year, where I do a guided hike to different places around the monument each month that you can find out on our Facebook page or our BLM website. But also we do work with the Friends of the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks to do a docent program where we train members of the public to do these kind of public programming. So kind of my counterpart who does a lot of these public interpretations is that actually like Dr. Tom Dormany, a retired NMSU professor who also does a Dripping Springs hike. He does one to La Cueva, he does one to Fillmore Canyon, and plenty of these other ones that go to the Friends website for those opportunities. But that's kind of just the basic story of Dripping Springs, or where it is and where we're located. But now, before we get into like why the buildings are there, we have to really tell the story about the two men that were involved in building Dripping Springs as we know it. So kind of our central figure is Eugene Van Patten. So he is a Yankee man that is born in Rome, New York in 1839. And so his story really comes into the El Paso, Las Cruces region when he ends up becoming a worker for the Butterfield Overland Mail Route, and which some of you may know that is our newest National Historic Trail that actually does go through the monument as well. It's about 20 miles of the historic trail go from about Picacho Peak area to the northwest of Las Cruces, and then heads west out of the Sierra de las Uvas and further west to the Arizona border. So that's how Van Patten comes into this region. And, the Butterfield Trail is really only in operation for like a very short 3-year period. But what ends the operation of the Butterfield Trail, because it starts in Memphis, Tennessee, or St. Louis, Missouri. They had two terminals, and it delivers mail and passengers to San Francisco, California. But in 1861, what happens is the Civil War. And so, what's really interesting about Van Patten is that he ends up joining the military to serve in the Civil War. But you would think that a relatively young man of 22 at this time, who was born in New York, would end up joining the Union Army, but he actually ends up fighting for the Confederacy. And from the documents that we have available to us that speak to Van Patten's history, we just really don't know his personal motivations for joining one side of the Civil War versus the other. But he was involved in a few kind of famous battles that occurred during the Civil War in New Mexico here. And after the Civil War, we see that Van Patten really starts to become this important figure in the early history of Las Cruces. So, kind of one of the most, besides building Dripping Springs, the hotel and resort, he is well known for helping to establish the La Corporación de los Indigentes de Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, which, as some of you may know, that is actually more commonly known as Tortugas Pueblo. So he was actually instrumental in helping Tortugas Pueblo get a land grant, which their Pueblo church and all their facilities currently sit on. But Van Patten was very much this, he was not content with just doing one thing. So he continued to serve in military capacities where he was well known like as Colonel Van Patten because he served in the New Mexico First Cavalry, and also he ended up responding to a few skirmishes or battles that involved Victorio, who was an Apache leader who led a rebellion in the 1880s. And also, Van Patten was well known as a sheriff, even though he served, as you see on the slide, like just 2 years, really. And also, we know from other documents that supposedly uh, Van Patten was involved with Teddy Roosevelt and forming like the Rough Riders. He knew like a lot of famous people. I don't think he knew Billy the Kid, as some sources say. They didn't really overlap historically, but he definitely knew like Pancho Villa, Pat Garrett, the Fountain family, Albert Fountain, that is, some of these big important people in early New Mexico history and Las Cruces history and the region, right? And so the picture on this slide is actually Eugene Van Patten as an older man. Don't really know quite exactly what date this was taken, but the three other men in the picture are Tigua Scouts. So these are men from like Isla del Sur, Pueblo, in El Paso, who assisted the U.S. Army in their battles against, the Apache nations during the late 1800s. So, Van Patten is this kind of early Las Cruces leader, but really what he's most known for is building this mountain camp in kind of the heart of the Organ Mountains, right up against kind of those stark rhyolitic cliffs that we all see every day when we look out our window. So Van Patten's mountain camp really starts first as like this 8-room hotel that just has a kitchen and dining hall. And so actually that's what you see in the original picture, or the picture on the right here. So it was just as you might know from like the ruins that stand today, that eventually would become a 2-story structure. But I wanted to point out it's not very clear in the photo, but here's Van Patten himself. This is probably taken about 1897 or late 1890s. So here he is actually sitting on kind of the front step or porch of the hotel. And what we know from like the records and the history is that so Van Patten, when he was living in El Paso, and he came to live in Las Cruces about 1872. But while he was in El Paso, he ended up marrying Benita Madrid Vargas, who was a Piro woman, so indigenous woman who was from El Paso, and she was reported to be like the daughter of like a local leader, a cacique. And so during the time that the hotel operated, that using Benita's connections, that a lot of indigenous men, the Piro men, and others from Pueblos were employed at the hotel. And so part of this complex, right, there's the hotel, but what's very important is when the hotel opens, that, right, this is very much before motorized transportation. So you have most people coming from El Paso or Las Cruces via horse and buggies, some sort of like horse-drawn transportation. And so the first set of ruins while you're hiking up Dripping Springs is actually what we call the livery. And the livery was kind of this area that the horses, were taken to be taken care of, brushed, refreshed, and then there was also a chicken coop on that site and a little vegetable garden and a mercantile as well. So it's really Van Patten, when he built this resort, he wanted to make it as self-sufficient as possible because even though Las Cruces was maybe like a few hours away via a horse-drawn buggy, it still was kind of a little bit tedious to bring supplies back and forth between town and then way out here in the mountains. And so, as I kind of referenced that the hotel, this is what it looked like when it was originally built, but it actually underwent two major building episodes. So this is kind of what the hotel, and maybe some of you have seen this. I think a similar picture is on the interpretive panels there at the site itself. But this is what it looked like at kind of its peak after the last major building episode was completed. So you'll see, right, that now the hotel is the second story, and they also built this kind of additional part. So what we kind of see that originally the hotel maybe had about 16 rooms for guests to stay, but with the second floor and with the addition of the adjacent building, that it was up to 32, and there was a lot more facilities. And you can kind of see in this picture, I don't know if you all can see my cursor, but that little sign that is on top of the hotel itself actually says Van Pen's Mountain Camp. And that's really the name that it was known by. We kind of say Dripping Springs kind of refers to the whole area, but in its heyday, this hotel was known as Van Pen's Mountain Camp. And you'll kind of notice too, like, there were some tents in the background. There used to be kind of like this enclosed area in front of the hotel that's now like where this is probably about the spot where we have that kind of bench under the tree. And this is an alternative view of the hotel at its height around 1906 as well. But I like pointing this out to people, right? You can see the stairs that are still there, but a lot of people don't know that there used to be a bandstand or a gazebo as well. There's still foundations of this gazebo there on site, but kind of the bench and the tree that are here are about here today. So it's kind of further back from the main trail. But you can see this was a pretty well-built resort, and Van Pen had invested quite a bit of money and material into it. But so why go to Van Patten's? Why was this kind of such an important or popular place for early Las Cruces and El Paso history? Well, think about even if you hike out today, that the temperature difference between the center of Las Cruces versus if you're standing in the shade of the mountains there at Van Penn's Mountain Camp or the Dripping Springs, it's like a few degrees, probably like 6, depending on the time of year. It's much cooler. So it really was this easy, accessible mountainscape for people living in Las Cruces and El Paso versus like, today a lot of people can make the drive up to Cloudcroft for the same reasons. I do that when it gets triple digit heat in the summer to go somewhere that's a little bit cooler. But this was really important for kind of early recreation and kind of outdoor um, leisurely activities because at this time in American history, there is, after the Industrial Revolution, people have more disposable income, and there's kind of this really start of like tourism or recreation. And so you can see in the black and white photos at the top of this slide that you have people all around Dripping Springs. The one on the left, they're at one of the reservoirs, kind of enjoying the view. Middle one are some women that are kind of hiking around the mountainscape. And then on the right here is some people actually, what they're looking at is one of the waterfalls that Dripping Springs is known for during the monsoon season. But this was a really important place where we have a lot of old testimonials, if you will, from the NMSU yearbooks that talk about how students would, travel up and basically spend the day at Van Patten's to just hike. There was a dance hall that was at the hotel, so it was very much this like easy to access getaway for people living in the region, right? But one thing I want to point out with the photos, especially the left and the middle one, you can see that, well, let's say the middle one, that, right, this was really before the invention of like sportswear or hiking gear. And really at the time, like it's very interesting to see that people would wear almost like their Sunday best when they're out, climbing these thorny, rocky places versus like what we probably wear today, or most of us do when we go out to explore these areas. So, Van Pann's Mountain Camp, like I said, it's built in 1905. And so then as the resort grows, then Van Penn ends up looking to start a partnership with Dr. Boyd. So I'll get to that in a little bit, but I wanted to give background to who Dr. Nathan Boyd was. So he is actually, he has this history where he's very much an entrepreneur. He's actually trained as a physician, but prior to coming to Las Cruces, in 1893, he has a lot of different investments. He's really an entrepreneur at the time. He marries this Australian woman who comes from like a very wealthy family. So he is a very kind of ambitious man. So one thing before he comes into our story, this picture of Dripping Springs, is that what Dr. Boyd is also more famously known for is that before the establishment of Elephant Butte Dam by the Bureau of Reclamation in the early 1900s, that there were several business ventures that tried to irrigate the Rio Grande and, try to establish these huge irrigation projects. But they ended up failing because as we kind of know today, that the water that's held in the Rio Grande is still a very sensitive international concern. How much of that water is sent further downstream to like Texas and Mexico. And so it ended up where Boyd's company did originally have a contract with the government to irrigate. There were issues where they didn't complete it on time. And then also there was this potential it could cause an international incident with Mexico if all this water is being used for American irrigation, and none of it's going to Mexico. So Boyd ends up actually having to forfeit that contract, and still to this day, interestingly, like there's some of his descendants that are still trying to seek legal action to retain the water rights of the whole Rio Grande itself. Um, but so when Boyd moves into our picture of Dripping Springs, it's about 1904. So this is about 9 years after Dripping Springs has kind of been established and is already a booming, exciting resort. So, but it was between the two men that Boyd saw, or both Van Patten and Boyd saw an opportunity to, have more of a financial partnership. And really, at this time, in American medical science, there was this idea that, oh, these mountainscapes, like the dry, cool mountain airs of the Western United States, are very therapeutic for people that are suffering from respiratory diseases such as tuberculosis. So, really, the agreement between the two men is that Boyd would be allowed to build a portion of his property on the adjacent property to Van Patten's. Boyd was allowed to build there, but any of his guests for like the first year would have to be supplied from Van Patten's hotel. So he was renting from Van Patten, and also a lot of Boyd's guests were being, fed and by Van Patten. So with this picture that we have on screen, this actually is a really interesting photo from 1904 that shows the very beginning of the building of what we kind of know today as the Boyd property or sanatorium. And so, most people might recognize that here, this is actually the foundation of the kitchen hall and kitchen and dining hall that is at the resort. And then some of these tents, this was approximately where the Boyd residence is, and some of the cottages that were later built. But it's interesting that we see in the early 1900s or around in the region that a lot of people would live in these canvas tents that were, pretty sturdy for the time, but they lived in them while their kind of more permanent home was being constructed. So yeah, kind of lived on site and kept working to build that house. So this is also another historic photo of the Boyd property. Add another 20 years. So this is the early 1920s. And this might be a little bit more familiar than the last picture because, right, this is the kitchen and dining hall that we know today. There's like an interpretive sign, the Boyd residence. But two, take note that these cottages aren't here today because some sources say that in the 1920s that someone had set fire to one of these buildings or both of them, and that actually has been confirmed from looking at some of the artifacts or material that are still left there because they are actually burned. So they didn't collapse through the ravages of time, but actually burned down. And notice here too that there's a few cars that are parked. Now we kind of hike up this kind of part, the lower part of the trail. You would kind of think like, oh, how could people drive all the way up here? But road was maybe a little bit more better maintained for vehicles. And then the far right hand, we have a few people that are kind of just sitting out in lawn chairs, kind of enjoying the view. So this partnership between Dr. Boyd and Van Pence quickly kind of goes south, where what we see almost within like a year's time that Van Patten actually ends up taking Boyd to court for unpaid debts. And this is kind of like the first battle in what ends up being a 13-year legal battle between the 2 men over the water and land of Dripping Springs. because during this first court case, what is so critical is that when Boyd was reviewing the land pen, so right, the title or deeds to the land itself, he noticed that Van Patten accidentally did not include or describe the lands that Boyd was building his property as part of Van Pan's property. So like Van Pan was saying he owned the land, but his legal description of it in his patent did not include Boyd's property. So then this led to a lot of legal back and forth that this court case would go to like the Secretary of the Interior to like the New Mexico Supreme Court. And in most cases, I think except for one, that they ruled in favor of Van Patten. But over time, this was just Boyd would appeal and kind of delay. And so a lot of what is said is, this definitely was taxing on Van Patten's finances. And so after, like I said, 13 years of this legal headache, that Van Patten ends up submitting a quitclaim deed for the entire property. So Boyd's and the historic hotel and resort in 1917 for $1. And we'll talk a little bit later about kind of more of the myths and legends, but a lot of people have interpreted selling the resort and the land for $1 as kind of like, oh, Van Patten must have been bankrupt or totally destitute. But knowing that to file a quitclaim deed, actually $1 is the minimal amount you need to submit that quitclaim. So he had to submit it and I think at this time he was so probably exhausted from all this that he just wanted out. So that's why he just put it up for $1 and essentially ceded it to Boyd. And then what we see now that Boyd has kind of the entire property, he continues to improve upon the water system that's there at Dripping Springs. So if you're hiking out there, you might, right, the most famous photograph of Dripping Springs is the Dripping Springs itself with the lower reservoir, which the trail goes by. But there's actually two other reservoirs that are above that. And we see that Boyd had a very kind of intricate piping system where there were fountains or cisterns that collected stored water, but also distributed it to like these fountains that people at the resort could drink from. But Boyd's history or total ownership of the property is very short. In basically a 5-year span, he is forced to sell the resort itself because what we see is that still at this time with Boyd, he's wrapped up in a lot of legal cases regarding this contest over irrigating the Rio Grande. And so it's plausible that his finances were also very, very much ruined by continued legal battles. So he ends up selling the resort to the Sexton family. So the Sextons are kind of known in Las Cruces history, but not known as like some other important figures, wherein Dr. Sexton was a local physician. And I kind of found it fascinating that Sexton actually used to be an older term for like underkeeper or crypt keeper. And there's still a street in town that is named after the Sextons. And Dr. Sexton, Dr. Troy Sexton, actually was mayor for a short time in the 1920s or 1930s, and his wife, Lena Sexton, was one of the first female postmasters in Las Cruces. So they end up buying the property, but really what we see from the kind of lack of documentation, it doesn't seem like the resort is kind of running at its full capacity like it did in its heyday under Van Patten's, where the Sextons are still letting people like camp and hike there, rent out some cottages. We have like one article that they ask just like a 25-cent donation to help maintain kind of the rocky road that leads to the resort. But it doesn't seem like the resort really has, a lot of employees, or it's just not not really seen as many visitors as it once did. And so this is a photo from 1923. So about that time, the Sextons operated the property, and it looks a little bit more overgrown at this stage, but that could just be kind of the ravages of time. But what we see with the Sextons that they end up owning the resort for about 17 years, and they don't live on site. They kind of just um, have it as like a getaway resort. And like I said, they still allow people to visit this hotel and resort. So about 1940, that after Dr. Troy Sexton passes away, Lena Sexton puts up the resort for sale. And so at this time, that there was kind of two groups that wanted to buy the resort. And so interestingly, even back in 1940, there was the Kiwanis Club of Las Cruces that wanted to buy this resort and turn it into a public park for Las Cruces. And they needed about $4,000 to purchase this property, but they ended up not being able to make that funds ready for purchase. And so Robert Boyd, so Dr. Boyd's son, is still in the area, and he ends up buying the property. And what we see is that Robert Boyd is very much like, he isn't interested in operating the resort. He's really operating it as kind of a ranch and a homestead. And you see in the photo on the right that this is a postcard or photo from 1941. And right, so this is a year after Robert Boyd ended up buying the property from the Sextons, but you can kind of see there's a little bit of wear and tear on the corrugated metal roofing, and the Van Patten mountain camp sign that was on top of the building is no longer there. And some of the trees don't look as healthy, but it could be, well, I guess it says July, but um, so this just kind of shows the kind of decay of the resort over time since Van Patten's ownership. And so kind of the last owners before this property became part of the public land system was the Cox family. So, right, A.B. Cox and Florence Cox purchased a lot of the private lands that was on the western side of the Oregons to consolidate enough land for their Z Ranch. So they bought a lot of property from kind of these more smaller homesteaders throughout the 1950s. So they owned, land from the north part of the Oregon Mountains down to like the Talavera neighborhood, and actually the Talavera neighborhood that, where Soledad Canyon is too, was once part of their property that they ended up selling. So kind of the modern area now, so from the late late 1970s, Mr. Cox passed away in 75, but over time, the Cox family, who had been, stewards of this land and had allowed people to, pick a picnic in the local area, they were great hosts. We have, stories. There's still a lot of people in our community today that talk about, the barbecues or kind of these events that the Coxes would put on as, the gracious hosts that they were. But even back, 50 years now, that the Coxes were already facing a lot of pressure from local developers who wanted to acquire their property and, build, let's say, right, more houses or, other kind of businesses in kind of the heart of these beautiful mountains. So the Coxes ended up looking to have these lands protected for future generations. And the easiest way to do this was for them to work with the Nature Conservancy, who was kind of a third party in all of this. And the Nature Conservancy bought the property and ended up transferring it to the Bureau of Land Management in 1988. And maybe some of you who have lived here for, for a good while, you might remember there was an Organ Mountain Music Festival in 1989 that was meant to kind of celebrate the opening of Dripping Springs Natural Area to the public after there was about 6 months of a lot of recreation improvements like, parking lots, the trails, signs, and all of that. And last kind of thing of note with the ruins itself that right after the Coxes had bought it, or really since the Sextons, there was not a lot of capital investment or maintenance performed on these buildings. And so right over nearly more than 75 years, a lot of these buildings had fallen into disrepair or ruin. And so in 1991, there was a huge effort between the BLM and the Park Service to help stabilize and maintain these buildings so that they could be enjoyed and experienced by future generations. So one thing I want to point out in this photo is that um, some of you might have had the inkling, but right, the lower picture is one of the buildings at the livery. And yeah, the livery is not, those buildings are not 100% like 100+ years old, that a lot of them were kind of like rebuilt and then stained. But all of this was done with the materials that were used at the time when these were built. So kind of um, the second part of this presentation is kind of talking about a lot of these misconceptions or like errors that I've seen talked about Dripping Springs, like, like a lot of stories or legends in the West, there's sometimes a grain of truth about stuff, but there's so many different versions of many stories when the story is a pretty good one. So the first one that even in the BLM's own literature and on the official proclamation that established the monument, we actually have the incorrect date for when the resort was built. So it says 1870. I have no idea why this date was chosen because from like the official legal paperwork for Van Patten's, he started homesteading the area around Dripping Springs in likely 1892. And then from the Homestead Acts that was passed in 1862, you had to live on the land for 5 years and improve it before you could kind of petition or patent it for it to be legally yours. Excuse me. And so this is where it's pretty clear that the hotel was actually built in 1895, not in 1870. And then another kind of smaller known like misinterpretation or common misinformation is that who was the Boyd that ended up buying the resort from the Sextons? And so what was interesting about the Boyd family is that what probably led to a lot of confusion is actually, excuse me, that many of the men in the family had the middle name Errol, which is Scottish. And so sometimes middle names were used in in deference to people's first names. So it's where they would say, oh, it was Errol Boyd, but then it's like there's at least three men that have the middle name Errol. There's no one actually called Errol Boyd. And so the one on the right, Robert Errol Boyd, he is actually the Boyd who ends up purchasing the property in 1940. Another one, so this is kind of the big one, but actually with the current interpretation that is at the Dripping Springs natural area is that we still have signs that call the Boyd property a sanatorium or sanitarium. But what's interesting that these terms are kind of used to describe like a health resort that typically like tuberculosis patients would go to recuperate their health and just seek medical care. But from all the historic documents that we have reviewed so far, is that the the term sanatorium is never actually used to describe either the Boyd property or the Dripping Springs Hotel and Resort in any capacity. Interestingly, that it is the first time the word sanatorium is used is actually through the work of Catherine Dirac. And you can kind of see a little clip on the side there where she wrote a lot about Dripping Springs during the, uh, let me see, sorry. And I'll get to those comments and questions later, but it's where she uses this term, and you see that her research was really what we use as the basis of foundation for interpretation at Dripping Springs today. So then, and why this has kind of been problematic is that if you type in like ghost stories of the sanatorium or Dripping Springs, you'll get a lot that talk about, people's experiences with, ghosts or having, certain feelings about the property. But, there's no documentation about like there being doctors or nurses there or like even patients who have died. It was still very much a health resort that people would come to recuperate their health, but often it's just people were going there to reside, taking the fresh air, and many of these people were not suffering from tuberculosis, that they were in such condition that they would be dying. It's a lot of people back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The tuberculosis was more latent and kind of lingered, and so the resort, it's, oh, you kind of go there for therapy, but this isn't where people were dying. And thing is too, there actually was a sanitarium, like an official sanitarium that was in Las Cruces operating at the same time as the hotel and resort. But this is just one of the most common misconceptions that I've seen when we talk about Dripping Springs. But kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about is like what are we kind of doing with Dripping Springs today, or what do we want to try to do? So Dripping Springs is this very important place for our local and even like state history that I've been working with New Mexico State University to try to get this property nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. And as some of you may know, the National Register is it contains, archaeological sites, monuments, historic buildings or other sort of places that are significant either to local, state, or national history. So back in the 90s, there were some attempts to make nominations, but they just never were complete. And so, since I've been working for the BLM, I've been trying to get this process underway so we can put it on the register. And so, photo, you can see one of the NMSU students is using a total station to kind of more accurately map out the livery there. And so what, like Bethany Stevens was the NMSU student, and her field crew, what they did at the resort, this was like a lot of research, not just with like the historical records, but on the grounds. They sketched a lot of the buildings. They took, GPS points. They recorded artifacts, really to help flesh out and tell the story of Dripping Springs. And why this and our National Register nomination is important because, oftentimes when registers are put on, or when properties are put on the register, that, we might have more funding available to help stabilize, preserve, these buildings that right? Over time, if we don't do anything, they can continue to crumble and kind of lose that ability to tell the story, right? And also, if we have something on the National Register that could help promote tourism, heritage tourism here in southern New Mexico, there are a few buildings in Las Cruces that are on the National Register, but not as many as you would think. So I that is kind of my presentation, and um, sorry, I kind of talked about that all in like one breath, it seemed like, but there was a lot to talk about, and just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of the good research that's been done for Dripping Springs and its history has been the work of Bethany Stevens. She graduated from NMCU a few years ago, and the field work that they did really helped to get us a better idea of the true history, or kind of more accurate history, of Dripping Springs. Then McKinney Brisky, she's actually still with the Bureau of Land Management and the state office, where she did a lot of research on her own about the property. And she was actually, a few years back, one of the park rangers for the National Monument. So you might have seen her do programming back a few years. And then a lot of the photos that I ended up using in this presentation come from New Mexico State University's Rio Grande Historical Collection. The photo from 1904 that showed the construction of the Boyd property was from Hillsborough Black Range Museum. And then a lot of these photos were either from old reports, or a lot of our volunteers that helped to staff the Dripping Springs Visitor Center.